She thought she stole my life savings. I want you to remember my name. Kathy. 75 years old, widow, and until 3 months ago, the kind of woman my daughter-in-law thought she could rob blind and walk away smiling. She took every single penny I had. $91,000. She counted it. She celebrated it. She even hugged me and called me sweet old thing on her way out the door. What she didn't know is that I let her take it. I planned for her to take it. And 3 days after she thought she'd won, she was on her knees on my kitchen floor, sobbing, begging me for forgiveness that I was never going to give her. Stay with me because this story still gives me chills and I lived it. Before I go any further, if you're the kind of person who believes karma isn't just a saying but a debt that always gets collected, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories like mine because I've got plenty. And I would love to know in the comments below, where in the world you're watching this from tonight. I read every single one of them with my coffee in the morning, so don't be shy. Now let me tell you how a 75-year-old grandmother outsmarted a woman who thought I was too old and too foolish to see what was coming. My name is Kathy. I was born in a small town, raised on a farm, and I married my husband Robert when I was 21 years old. We built a life together brick by brick, dollar by dollar. Robert worked in construction for 38 years, and I taught 3rd grade for 31. We were not rich people. We were careful people. We saved instead of spending, we fixed instead of replacing, and by the time Robert passed away 4 years ago, we had built up a nest egg that most folks our age would call a small fortune. $91,000 in a savings account, plus the house fully paid off, sitting on 2 acres just outside of town. We had one son. His name was Michael. He was our whole world, our only child, born after 2 miscarriages that nearly broke my heart before he ever arrived. I raised that boy to be honest, to be kind, and to work hard for everything he had. And for most of his life he was exactly that. He went to college, he got a good job in logistics, and at 29 he married a woman named Brenda. I remember the first time I met Brenda. She was polished. Beautiful, really, in the way that takes effort and money to maintain. She complimented my house, my cooking, my garden. She called me mom within the first month, which should have warmed my heart, and for a while it did. I was lonely after Robert passed, and Brenda seemed to fill some of that emptiness. She started coming by twice a week, bringing me little gifts, sitting with me for tea, asking about my health, my finances, my will. At the time, I thought she was just being a good daughter-in-law. Looking back, I understand now that every single visit was reconnaissance. Started small, the way these things always do. Brenda would mention how expensive things were getting, how Michael's job wasn't paying what it used to, how they were thinking about starting a family but couldn't afford it in this economy. I'd slip her a couple $100s here and there, the way any grandmother-to-be would. I didn't think twice about it, but the requests kept growing. 500 became 1,000. 1,000 became 3,000 for a car repair that, I later learned, never happened. Every time she had tears in her eyes, and every time Michael would call me afterward, sounding embarrassed, saying, "Mom, you really didn't have to do that," but never once telling her to stop asking. I started noticing things about a year ago. Small things. Brenda began asking more pointed questions. Not how are you feeling, but have you updated your will lately? Not how's your health, but who has power of attorney if something happens to you? At first, I brushed it off as her being practical. She worked in some kind of financial planning office, or so she claimed, and I figured she just thought that way. But then I noticed she was always the one steering our conversations toward my money, my accounts, my house, my mortality. Never once did she ask about my happiness. Never once did she ask what I actually wanted for the rest of my life. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring. Brenda showed up unannounced, which wasn't unusual by then, but this time she brought paperwork. She said Michael was struggling more than he let on, that they were behind on their mortgage, that if things didn't change soon, they might lose their house, the house where my only grandchild, a little girl named Ellie, was growing up. She cried real tears sitting at my kitchen table. She held my hand and told me she didn't know who else to turn to. She said that if I truly loved my family, I would help them consolidate their debt by adding her name to my accounts, just temporarily, just so she could help manage things and make sure the bills got paid on time while Michael worked overtime to catch up. Now, here is where I need you to understand something about me. I taught 3rd grade for 31 years. You do not survive 3 decades in an elementary school classroom without becoming an excellent judge of when someone is lying to you. Children lie constantly and clumsily, and so do adults who think grief and old age have made a woman stupid. Brenda's tears were real, I'll give her that. But grief doesn't explain why a woman brings pre-filled bank authorization forms to a conversation she claims is spontaneous. It doesn't explain why she already knew my account numbers. It doesn't explain why, when I excused myself to use the bathroom, I came back to find her photographing documents from my filing cabinet with her phone. I said nothing that day. I smiled, I told her I needed to think about it, and I let her leave with the impression that she had softened me up. But that night I didn't sleep. I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea gone cold and I thought about Robert, about how hard we worked for that money, and about what kind of woman photographs an old lady's private documents while she's in the bathroom. And I made a decision. If Brenda wanted to play this game, I was going to let her think she was winning it. The very next morning I called my nephew, a man named Franklin who works as an accountant, and I asked him to come see me. Franklin had always been sharp and, more importantly, he was someone Brenda had never bothered to charm because she didn't see him as useful to her plans. I told him everything. The visits, the questions, the crocodile tears, the photograph documents. Franklin's face went hard and he said, "Aunt Kathy, I think you're about to be scammed by your own family." I told him I already knew that. What I needed from him was a plan. Over the next 2 weeks, Franklin and I built something Brenda never saw coming. First, we went to my bank and I opened a brand new account under my maiden name, through a small credit union 2 towns over, one Brenda had never heard of and would never think to check. I moved $88,000 of my $91,000 into that account quietly, over several small transfers so nothing would trigger suspicion on a bank statement. I left exactly $3,000 in my original visible account, the one Brenda already knew about, the one she'd been circling like a vulture for months. Then I did something that still makes me smile when I think about it. I called Brenda and told her I had reconsidered. I told her I wanted to help Michael and Ellie, and that I was ready to add her name to my account so she could manage the household bills like she'd suggested. You should have seen how fast she showed up with the paperwork that time. She practically ran through my front door. I signed everything she put in front of me without much fuss, because I knew exactly what she was actually getting access to. An account with $3,000 in it, dressed up to look on paper like it held far more, because I'd also handed her an old, outdated bank summary from months earlier that I'd conveniently left sitting on the counter, one that reflected the original $91,000 balance, and never corrected her assumption. Brenda didn't drain the account slowly. That wasn't her style. 2 days after I signed those papers, she withdrew the entire visible balance in one transaction and closed it out entirely, transferring what she found into an account of her own. She thought she'd gotten away with a fortune. In reality, she'd stolen $3,000 and burned every bridge of trust in the family to do it. But here's the part that made this whole plan worth it. I didn't just want to protect my money. I wanted the truth to come out, in a way nobody could deny or explain away. So before Brenda ever touched a cent, Franklin had helped me set up a small hidden camera in my kitchen, disguised as a decorative clock on the wall, the same room where Brenda always did her talking, her crying, her convincing. It had been recording every single visit for weeks, every mention of consolidating debt, every claim about Michael losing his job, every moment she pressured a 75-year-old widow into signing documents. And most importantly, it had recorded the day she photographed my private papers without my permission. 3 days after she emptied that account, I invited the whole family over for Sunday dinner, the way I always did. Michael, Brenda, and little Ellie. I made a roast, the way Robert used to like it, and I sat everyone down at the table like nothing in the world was wrong. Brenda was practically glowing that day, relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months, probably because she thought her problem was solved and her mother-in-law was none the wiser. That's when I asked Michael a simple question. I asked him how the mortgage payments were going. Now that Brenda had gotten that money to help catch things up, Michael looked confused. He said, "What money, Mom?" And I watched Brenda's face change color in real time. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply told my son that 3 days earlier, his wife had withdrawn every dollar from an account I had given her access to, under the pretense of helping pay their mortgage, a mortgage Michael then quietly admitted, stumbling over his words, they were not actually behind on at all. In fact, Michael revealed something I hadn't even known. They just put a down payment on a new car 2 weeks prior. Cash. Brenda had told him it was a work bonus. I let that sit in the room for a moment. And then I told them both about the camera. I told them I had weeks of footage of Brenda pressuring me, photographing my documents, and manipulating a grieving old widow for money that was never going toward any mortgage, any bonus baby, any real family need at all. I told them the account she'd drained wasn't even my real savings. It was a decoy I built specifically to see how far she would go. And she went exactly as far as I suspected she would. Michael sat frozen at that table, staring at his wife like he was seeing her for the first time. Brenda tried to talk her way out of it, the same way she talked her way into my kitchen 100 times before. She said I was confused. She said old people misremember things. She actually looked me in the eye and told my own son that grief had made me paranoid and delusional. That's when I placed my phone on the table and pressed play on 30 seconds of footage, her own voice, her own face, coaching me on exactly what paperwork to sign 3 weeks earlier while promising it was just temporary, just to help. Nobody said anything for a long time after that. 3 days later, the part came that I mentioned at the very beginning of this story, the part where she dropped to her knees on my kitchen floor. Because in those 3 days, everything Brenda had built came crashing down at once. Michael had gone through their joint accounts that very night and discovered she'd been quietly siphoning money for over a year. Not just from me, but from their own joint savings, funneling thousands into a separate account he never knew existed. He found receipts for jewelry he'd never seen her wear. Hotel charges for nights he thought she was working late. It turned out my daughter-in-law hadn't just been targeting a lonely widow for a payday. She'd been living a double life, planning an exit, and using me as her final cash grab before she vanished from our family entirely, taking Ellie with her. Michael filed for divorce within the week. He also, on Franklin's advice, filed a police report regarding the fraudulent withdrawal, since Brenda had used forged authorization to access funds under false pretenses. That footage I'd recorded wasn't just for my own satisfaction. It became evidence. Brenda showed up at my door 3 days after that family dinner, mascara running down her face, and she got down on her knees right there in my kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd manipulated me for months, and she begged me to tell Michael it was all a misunderstanding. She begged me to make the police report disappear. She said she loved this family. She said she made mistakes, but she never meant to hurt anyone. I looked down at this woman kneeling on my floor, and I felt something I didn't expect to feel. Not triumph. Not anger. Just a quiet, tired sadness. I told her that I was a retired schoolteacher, and in 31 years, I learned that people don't accidentally photograph private documents. They don't accidentally hide a second bank account for over a year. They don't accidentally use an elderly widow's grief as a financial strategy. I told her that everyone in that family had loved her, trusted her, made room for her at our table, and she had used every single ounce of that love as a weapon against us. I told her I forgave her, because holding on to hatred at 75 years old is a luxury I don't have time for. But forgiveness and consequences are two very different things, and I was not going to protect her from what she had built with her own 2 hands. By then it truly was too late for everyone involved. Too late for Brenda, who lost her marriage, her daughter's full-time custody, and very nearly avoided criminal charges only because Michael, in the end, out of love for Ellie's future and not wanting her mother in jail, asked the district attorney not to pursue it, on the condition Brenda pay back every dollar and enter supervised visitation only. Too late for Michael, who had to explain to his 4-year-old daughter why mommy wasn't living with them anymore, and who still, to this day, struggles to trust his own judgment after not seeing what was happening under his own roof. And in some ways, too late for me because even though I protected my money, I couldn't protect my family from the fracture this caused. Ellie spends weekends with me now. Michael is slowly rebuilding. And I keep my $88,000 exactly where it's always been, safe, quiet, and completely out of reach from anyone who thinks an old woman is too soft to see them coming. People ask me sometimes if I regret setting that trap. If I regret letting things go as far as they did instead of confronting Brenda the very first time I suspected something was wrong. And my answer is always the same. If I had confronted her early, she would have denied it, cried her way out of it, and continued the exact same behavior in the shadows, more carefully next time. Sometimes the only way to protect the people you love is to let someone show you exactly who they are. In their own words, with their own hands on camera, where nobody can argue with the truth afterward. I am 75 years old. I raised a good son on a schoolteacher's salary and a construction worker's paycheck. I buried my husband and grieved him properly, without letting that grief turn me into an easy target. And when a woman who called me mom decided that my age made me weak, I let her believe it, right up until the moment the truth walked through my front door and dropped her straight to her knees. If you've ever been underestimated because of your age, your kindness, or your trust, I want you to know something. Being underestimated is not a weakness. It is the greatest advantage you will ever have, if you're patient enough to use it. If this story meant something to you tonight, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing my story reached you, wherever in the world you might be sitting right now. And if you've got a story of your own, one where somebody underestimated you and lived to regret it, I want to hear it. Because those are exactly the kind of stories that keep me going. This is Kathy, and until next time, remember, it's never too late to protect what you worked your whole life to build.